generous and intelligently as England had treated France after Napoleon's defeat, Europe might have known another century of peace. The long conflict between Germany and France could have ended on terms as advantageous to both, and as conducive to the European peace as the Anglo-French collaboration, which succeeded centuries of rivalry and war between England and France. Instead, France saw a fictitious security by disarming the Teutonic giant while giving him every reason to plot for revenge. The crushing burden of reparations of the Germans were required to pay, and the denial to Germany of a secure and honorable status among the nations of Europe so enfeebled German democracy that the Nazis won power, and France was overwhelmed by the forces she herself had created. It may be true that the lesson to be learned from history is that mankind learns nothing from it. But the explanation for the failure of the Western democracies to read the lesson of the immediate past seems mainly due to the effect of war propaganda and ignorance of the lack of integrity of the molders of public opinion. The pen is still mightier than the sword and is responsible for more human misery when unscrupulously employed in psychological warfare. As Samuel Johnson wrote in the 18th century, quote, "I know not whether more is to be feared from the streets filled with soldiers, accustomed to plunder, or from garrets filled with scribblers, accustomed to lie." End quote. War propaganda and the falsification of history indulged in its multitude of journalists, authors, professors, and politicians has convinced the American public that the Germans have a peculiar aversion to democracy and are innately aggressive people who will always attempt to rule the world unless kept down and taught to love democracy by a long period of instruction in a reformatory. Only those who have studied the history of Europe know that Germany did not become a militarist nation until centuries of French aggression, from the days of Richelieu to Napoleon's conquests, had caused a reaction which enabled Prussia to forge the modern German state out of the disunite and powerless congeries of kingdoms, principalities, and free cities, which constituted the Germanies before the French Revolution. Americans who have dined into their ears for years that Germany has attacked France 3 times within living memory will be astonished at reading what was said at the time in Britain and the United States about the Franco-Prussian War. The London Times on July 16, 1870, wrote as follows, quote, "The greatest national crime that we have had the pain of recording in these columns since the days of the First French Empire." Let me rephrase. "The greatest national crime that we have had the pain of recording in these columns since the days of the First French Empire has been consummated. War is declared, an unjust but premeditated war. The dire calamity which overwhelms Europe with dismay it is now too clear, the act of France, of one man in France. It is the ultimate result of personal rule. There can be no doubt as to the side on which the world's sympathies will be enlisted, and whatever may on former occasions have been the offense of Prussia, she will be in this instance have on her side all the moral support which is seldom denied to those who take up arms in self-defense." End quote. George Bancroft, the U.S. minister in Berlin, reported as follows: "The leading statesmen, as well as public opinion in regards to the present war, essentially as an act of self-defense on Germany's part, and the outstanding task is to ensure Germany permanently by a better system of frontiers against new wars of aggression on the part of her Western neighbors, of which the past 3 centuries have brought so large a number." End quote. Going on. "The tragedy of modern history is that the Germans have always been kicked around when they were passively minded, with the natural result that the apostle of violence has again and again won the leadership of the nation, following the failure of the Democrats and anti-militarists to win a fair deal for the German people or protect them from attack. Having been girded their loins to resist French aggression and force France to abandon her centuries-old ambition to establish her hegemony over the continent, the Germans proceeded, once Bismarck's influence was withdrawn, to follow in France's footsteps. Nevertheless, the popular conception of the Germans as the cause of all recent wars is erroneous. In the half-century which elapsed between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, Germany was at peace, whereas Britain and France conquered most of Africa and extended their Asiatic colonial empires. Russia fought Turkey and Japan, and the United States acquired new territory by wars with Spain and Mexico. Having both studied and taught history at London University in the 1920s, when the war passions had cooled, and having had the privilege of knowing the eminent British historian Dr. G. P. Gooch, who with other scholars was establishing the facts concerning the causes of World War I am also aware that Germany cannot be regarded as solely responsible for the first act in the tragedy of Western civilization. Diplomatic documents made public by the Bolsheviks, together with those from the Vienna archives, proved that Tsarist Russia and the Habsburgs were more responsible for the outbreak of the war than Germany. As Gustav Stoffler, Stolper, has written, not one historian of international repute of any nationality during the 1920s and early 1930s maintained that Germany alone was responsible, while several outstanding historians, particularly British and American, went far in establishing Germany's comparative innocence, end quote. The facts of history were overlaid by the propaganda during World War II and are today forgotten. But no one can deny that after the defeat in World War I, the Germans for a time swung back and embraced pacifism and democracy with the same fervor as they had formerly followed their militarist. The Constitution of the Weimar Republic guaranteed so many freedoms that allowed license to both communists and Nazis, first to undermine and then finally destroy the German Republic. The Weimar Republic might have survived its own inner weaknesses if France had been willing to bury the hatchet and pursue as an enlightened a policy towards Germany as the British, who soon after the war's end realized the stupidity of stifling the democratic forces in Germany by the full implementations of the Versailles Treaty. In 1923, the French, against British advice, occupied the Ruhr, and in efforts to squeeze blood out of a stone and obtain the huge reparations the German Republic could not possibly pay. The Germans countered this high-handed action by a general strike in the Ruhr, which, although it eventually forced the French to retreat, toppled Germany over into bankruptcy. The runaway inflation which ruined the middle classes, laid the basis for the Nazi movement. At the same time, the misery of the working classes drove many to abandon social democratic leadership and followed the communists. Listen to that. At the same time, the misery of the working classes drove many to abandon social democratic leadership and follow the communists. The intervention of America postponed the crisis for a decade. American loans and credits rescued the Weimar Republic and enabled Germany to pay a scaled-down annual indemnity while also presenting an appearance of prosperity. There remained a hard core of unemployment amounting to about 2 million. but German industry was re-equipped and rationalized with the help of American loans. Germany's hope of meeting her obligations depending on expanding world trade and continuing American credits. The world economic crisis drastically reduced German exports, brought an end to American credits, and destroyed any possibility of Germany's being able to pay either reparations or interest on her loans. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the United States and the 1931 Ottawa Conference, which raised a tariff wall around the British Empire, completed the ruin of German democracy. Germany's export trade was reduced by half, and unemployment, bank failures, and bankruptcies produced such desperation on all sides that the extremists on the right and the left were able to destroy the democratic parties, which had strained so hard and under such tremendous handicaps to make the German people reject militarism and place their trust in a rational and peaceful world order. President Hoover endeavored to prevent the crisis in Germany and all Europe by his moratorium on international debts. President Roosevelt, by torpedoing the London Economic Conference and devaluating the dollar, gave a further mighty impetus to the economic warfare, which is the curtain raiser to the tragedy of World War II. In desperate economic distress, disarmed and denied equal rights with other nations, with half its industrial population underemployed, and possessing no such imperial revenues as Britain, France, Holland, and Belgium to support its workless millions, Germany succumbed to Hitler, the false messiah who promised work and bread, and a free, strong Germany in place of the impotent Weimar Republic, extinguished German democracy. The Nazis not only took advantage of economic distress, they played upon the national resentments and fears. As H.A.L. Fisher, the eminent British historian, wrote in his History of Europe, quote, "The disarmament imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles has never willingly been accepted by a nation of soldiers, and the Germans entitled to claim either they should be allowed to rearm or that a reduction of armaments should be seriously undertaken by their neighbors." With a rare unanimity of passionate emotion, the youth of Germany claimed equality of treatment and protested against the continuance of a system which left them helpless before the airplanes, the tanks, the heavy artillery of Poles, Czechs, and Frenchmen. The long delays of the League militated against the authority of the Social Democrats, who stood for fulfillment of the treaties, and had been prepared to make sacrifices for the European peace. For 7 years, Germany had wooed Geneva, and wooed in vain, end quote, from H.A.L. Fisher. Going on. To the Germans, for a few years it seemed that Hitler was eminently right, and the German Democrats profoundly wrong, for everything that had been denied to the latter was given to Hitler without a struggle. From 1933 to 1939, the truth of the maxim that might makes right and that justice is always denied to the weak was proved over and over again. The union with Austria, denied to the German Democrats when it could have alleviated the economic crisis which was rendering their positions untenable, was permitted to Hitler. The right to self-defense, denied to the Weimar Republic, was not questioned till long after the Nazis had extended it to mean the right to attack others. After Hitler came to power, the Germans found themselves able to win every right denied to them when they were democratic. The German common man, who had stood idle at the street corners or looked vainly for work, and felt himself an outcast in a society which had no use for his labor, now had permanent employment and a sense of security so long as he obeyed orders. Whereas the world's republic had been shut to German exports under the Weimar Republic, Dr. Schacht opened the gates to German trade by his barter treaties concluded outside the international monetary system controlled by London and New York. The Germans, who suffered great privations when they followed the lead of the Social Democrats, had